This is the editing room of a scholar, a professor of philosophy. His name is Huston Smith. For 6 months, Dr. Smith has been doing research on a special project and recording his findings on film. His purpose has been more than usually serious and profound. He's made an attempt to discover America's own moral answers to 16 of the most basic public and private issues that Americans face. In his search, Dr. Smith has traveled thousands of miles and asked literally hundreds of questions. He's talked with scholars and statesmen, newspaper editors and economists, philosophers and politicians. Tonight, from these priceless film records of that journey, Dr. Smith has drawn together what he believes are America's best answers to another basic problem of our future. Tonight on The Search for America.
I'm Huston Smith. The object of our search tonight is American education. The question, what should we be teaching our children and how should we be teaching it? The American schools have been at the heart of the American dream. They've been the repository of our hopes for a better future. In the past, we've been proud of them, perhaps complacently proud. But that's changed. A long line of black-gowned figures with bright, youthful faces used to be the delight of copywriters looking for a symbol of America's future. Today, it's come to be seen as a line of ill-informed children whose intellectual nakedness is not hidden by an academic gown. The schools today have become the focus of criticism so severe that it might better be called an attack. But let's not blame the schools only. Since most of them are locally controlled, an attack against the American school is really an attack against the dominant values of the American community. In looking for people who could shed the most light on this problem of American education, there was no end of possible candidates. But I was looking for some very special people, and I think I found them. The first was Mark Van Doren, who for the last 30 years has been teaching at Columbia University in New York City. His only credentials were the magnificent performance of his students and the universal esteem in which they and his colleagues regard him. But that was enough. He still lives, as he has for the past 20 years, at 393 Bleecker Street in the heart of New York City's Greenwich Village. It's a pleasant neighborhood, but the harsh realities of city life are never far away, an appropriate setting for the man I was about to meet. Mr. Van Doren, do you think that American education is in good shape?
No.
Why not?
Among young people these days, I observe a tendency to pretend to be more ignorant even than one is. Yes. My son Charles, who you know was on television about a year ago,
yes,
and answered questions in a quiz program successfully for 15 or 16 weeks, was amazed by the correspondence that poured in on him, and I saw some of that correspondence from teachers and parents and even girlfriends of boys, all of whom said that they were very happy to see that there was a young man who knew something and didn't seem to be bothered by it, actually seemed to be happy with his knowledge. A number of girls wrote and said they wished they knew any boys who weren't ashamed of knowing something.
Mr. Van Doren, what specific steps do you think should be taken to improve American education?
I think our students could learn a great deal more and learn it faster than they do now. That means that we must work them harder, have less pity on them.
Well, certainly somewhere along the line, Mr. Van Doren, every student reaches a point at which it makes no sense for a society to carry it further in its full-time education. Now, what point do you think this is for most students? Do you think, for example, that every young American man and woman should go through high school?
Oh, yes, I think everyone should go through college.
Everyone should go through college.
Yes, that's an ideal statement. There might be a certain number who couldn't possibly do it, but we should make every effort to take every student as far as he can go, and not be too sure that we have discovered his limit before we really have. There are famous cases of students who became good only when they were juniors in college, for instance. I've seen that myself as a college teacher. A student just wakes up when he's 21 years old. Now, a system that put him out 4 or 5 years before that would have made a mistake.
You have spoken of your dissatisfaction with many things in American education. Do you know of anywhere where education on the whole is better than it is here?
Well, it has been better in Europe for many centuries, in England and France, now in Russia. Incidentally, the Russians not only study mathematics and science, they study literature. No people is more interested in Shakespeare today than the Russian people. They're crazy about him. They perform him much more than we do. Their favorite play happens to be Othello for some reason, but they play Othello hundreds of times a year. They read more than we do. The Russian people read more fiction and poetry and philosophy than we do. I'm afraid the Russians are good in their education on all fronts. That's what's really serious. I wouldn't worry about them if they were merely turning out some screwball scientists. They seem to take science seriously. It isn't a screwball thing for them. The principles of discovery, the truly mathematical and difficult parts of science, they seem to be devoting a great deal of attention to it.
In Russia, of course, this tremendous emphasis in education is backed by government support and is centralized in government control. Do you think that American education should receive federal support and perhaps also should be under federal control as well?
Well, that's a terribly interesting question. I wish I knew more about it. I wish I had thought I had the right to an opinion about it. There's no question in my mind, or in many minds these days, you gather that from what you read, there's no question that our education must be better and harder and must get that way as fast as possible. Now, the question is whether we are going to do that by ourselves, meaning the people. It's hard to distinguish between us and our government. The Constitution begins, we the people of the United States. The people are the government, and the government is the people. We know that. And yet, from time to time, the people of the United States have been content to let their government do things for them. The question whether in all the parts of the country, not only states, but towns and cities and even rural communities, the question whether in all those parts of the country, simultaneously, the desire for better education will spring up and results be achieved everywhere soon enough, or whether the government is going to be asked by the people to do it for them is a question that I must confess I don't know how to answer. My instincts all make me hope that we will do it ourselves. But it's a question how much time we have. It's a question of whether or not we can afford to take our time. That's the famous question with democracy. It's slow. France, of course, educates its people, all of its children, with an absolute uniformity. Every child of 12 in France knows certain things, and there are systems of inspection which make sure that he does.
How do you think this works out on the whole?
It's said to have worked out magnificently. The French are still the most literate people in the world, I believe. Now, you hear also that the poor little French boy and girl is worked very hard. They're pale and they don't have much recreation. They don't have much exercise, and so forth.
But I take it you're not against this.
I think we can afford to punish our children a little more. We're so anxious to have them happy that we forget that the chief happiness of man is in the use of his mind.
This seems to be verging on my next question, for I was just going to ask you, what do you feel to be the ultimate aim of education? We've talked about a lot of specifics, but what is its final purpose?
Well, I think I've already suggested it. I think it's the liberation of everybody into the use of his own mind. It's making him free of his mind, free with his mind, free in his mind. That's all education can be expected to do. It can't be expected to save the world. I'm afraid that's too much to ask of it, or maybe it's too little to ask of it. I think the great thing that it has to do is to make each man free, and the only way we can be free is by coming into possession of all the intellectual apparatus that we have.
Mr. Van Doren, do you think that the American people have within them to rise to what our times demand in this matter of education?
Well, I have complete faith that they have. I have great faith in our people, and I hope nothing that I've said could be construed as meaning that I do not love our people very much and think that they have everything that any people needs to have. They've always been able to do what they needed to do. I think they can do this, but it might be their toughest assignment so far.
A few weeks later, 450 miles due north of that pleasant apartment in the village, I finally had the chance to meet a man I had admired for a long time. He was William Ernest Hocking, a former colleague of James and Royce and Santayana and Whitehead at Harvard, and I think it's fair to say, Dean today of America's living philosophers. 84 years old, Dr. Hocking now lives alone in an old farmhouse at the end of a country road high up in the New Hampshire mountains. It was late spring, and my wonderful fortune to get in on the last snowfall of the season. The pursuit of knowledge is not always so rigorous, but every difficulty was more than made up for by the man I was about to see. Dr. Hocking, you've been involved in education all your life, and you've also traveled very widely abroad. How do you think that American education compares with education in other countries?
And I should say that on the whole, American education is more light-hearted than education, let us say, in either England or Germany or Italy or Holland. In all of these lands you find a certain seriousness, not only in the conduct of education, but in the feeling of the students.
Why do you think it is that American students take education less seriously than European students do?
It has a great deal to do with our extraordinary American good fortune, and something to do with the feeling that things ought to come our way without paying the price. As we learn, perhaps through gentle humiliations or less gentle humiliations, that there is a price to be paid, education will begin to be a serious matter in America as well.
Dr. Hocking, America is founded on the ideal of democracy, and this involves the idea of natural rights. Do you think that everyone has a right to education?
This is one of the leading fallacies to which our notion of democracy is subject. We have a right to certain self-expressions because of our nature. But education is not a form of expression which belongs to our nature. It isn't like the right to breathe. It isn't like the right of liberty in the sense that one has a right to exercise those human functions which belong to the mature individual. The right to an education might exist if education were something to be received as a commodity or to be used. But education is not a commodity. It cannot be transferred. Education, on the whole, I should say, is an entering into our heritage as human beings. It's a foreshortening of the journey of the human race from primitive times to the present state of civilization. That foreshortening of the journey is something which is itself a journey. And it's a journey which must be undertaken with a sense of its gravity and a sense of the necessity, of its necessity to our own full maturity, to take our fair part in the contemporary world.
Dr. Hocking, do you think that education should follow the student's interests?
Interest is important, but it isn't there until it is touched. The student hasn't any ready-made fund of interest which has to be consulted. The thing is that every child has an intellectual appetite until it is destroyed. The intellectual appetite is a readiness to be interested in anything that deserves interest. And the thing that we have to bring to children is not a consulting of their interest as something ready-made, but it is to elicit an interest in those things which we know are capable of arousing interest and should be, and in which he wishes to be interested, if they are presented by somebody who cares. The trouble is that the children need to be convinced. And they're unconvinced because these things are presented in a namby-pamby way, but people are themselves relatively indifferent. Consequently, the hidden fire doesn't emerge. Interest is only another name for fire. It's only another name for zest. And it implies that the children are ready for difficulties. The students want difficulties. They want the hard things. We don't believe that. It's just a characteristic of youth. It craves difficulty if it believes that the difficulty is worthwhile.
You think our American educational system on the whole is too soft, then?
Soft and multifarious.
Multifarious. Well, on just that point, considering the enormous range of knowledge and the almost infinite variety in human aptitudes, is it possible that education in its content, too, might be infinitely diverse?
One judges by the swelling catalogues of colleges that there is a movement toward infinity. And if it could only reach that goal, I think its inherent absurdity would become manifest at that point. The idea that multiplication of courses has anything to do with the value of education is one of the peculiar fallacies of our time. We live in a period characterized by too muchness all around. Too many good things, too many good journals to read, too many newspapers, too many amusements, too many facilities of life, too many gadgets. Too muchness means shallowness with regard to anything. It means the lack of the leisure and care necessary to win an honest appreciation. It seems to me best illustrated perhaps in the development of the moving picture program, in which perhaps 2 or 3 or 4 subjects are presented in an evening to persons who are fully capable of becoming concerned and interested with one. But if you are really engaged in a story and you're really involved in the characters, to switch from one story to another is an act of disloyalty.
Violence, maybe.
Violence, which is an act of violence to the need of the soul to meditate on whatever is valuable. Now this calculated disloyalty, as though muchness were somehow going to increase the capacity of the human being, is an educational It's an educational misdemeanor. I won't say an educational crime. Its motives are good, but it's an entire fallacy. And what we've got to do is to cultivate the virtue of paucity in what we offer and what we put before students for selection.
Now, by this virtue of paucity, you mean that there are some manageable number of subjects which are essential to education?
There are some essentials. There are some topics and themes for which there is no substitute.
No substitute.
And the whole doctrine of equivalence, which has honeycombed this immense array, choosing here and there a program which will be equivalent to some other program. That is one of the most pernicious fallacies of contemporary education.
What are these subjects for which we should accept no substitutes?
One may consider education in this light of a recapitulation of the race's acquisitions, which growth. And if one considers that the growth of the present civilization has been through struggle, through a struggle for mastery of some inherent difficulties in the situation of life, one is on the way to singling out certain essentials without which no one today can be called an educated man. The essential struggles are, I think, in the first place, the struggle which has resulted in our mathematical physics, the struggle which has given us the thought mastery of nature through realizing that there's an inherent necessity in the connection of natural phenomena, a necessity which is expressed in mathematical form. And then there is the struggle which comes out in the working out of a complex economy in a numerous society, the necessity of meeting interests through understanding rather than through conflict, an interest in the management of the technique of economy, and in the division of economy, the matters of production and of distribution. The Marxians are not at all wrong in singling out the importance of economy in the concept of a civilization. The question is whether it is overdrawn in its importance. Its centrality is inescapable. Economics is one of the things without which civilization as it is today can simply not be understood. And then there is the struggle of right, the struggle between different conceptions of right, the struggle which is embodied in the discipline of law. One of the chief delinquencies, I think, of our time in our college programs is the banishment of law to a professional specialty, whereas it belongs to every citizen to know the fundamentals of the law on which our civilization succeeds in maintaining an almost incredible diversity of interests with a minimum of internal conflict. Law should be one of the three essentials, one of the three tough disciplines which belong to the curriculum of every man who proposes to call himself educated.
So these three things then would form the heart of the college curriculum in your view?
The three tough disciplines, inescapable and necessary.
Yeah. I take it this means that not all young people should go to college.
I agree with that. Not all young people should go to college. There certainly is not a democratic right that everyone should have a college education, nor perhaps a high school education. There are other forms of preparation for useful activity, but we should not prostitute the primary educational system of our country to make one thing equivalent to that with which it is not equivalent.
Dr. Hocking, you've given your entire life to education. What would you say is education's fundamental purpose in human life?
To introduce a human being to the secrets of his own power to create, and thereby to win through freedom and through suffering if necessary the will which is inseparable from all greatness, the will to create, to suffer in creation, the will to suffer in creation. Unless we have that will to suffer in creation, we are unworthy to take our part in the travail of humanity.
A big nation is not necessarily a great one, but the words that make for greatness have, I think, been spoken tonight. Discipline, struggle, a love of things of the mind, the will to create, these are words that directly challenge the easygoing, passive, indifferent life that ad writers would tell us is the American way. Togetherness isn't a substitute for individual effort, and education isn't a chocolate that can be dropped in the pupil's mouth. Democracy need not mean that everyone sink towards the lowest level. It could mean that everyone rises to its highest. More than any other institution in our society, education has the chance to prove this fact. But if it does, it's going to have to listen closely to the aims of education as we've heard them tonight. To introduce a human being to the secret of his power to create, and to win thereby, through freedom and through suffering, if necessary, the will that is inseparable from all greatness.
This is National Educational Television.